Hello, and welcome to another episode of On Target. I'm your host, Zuri Linetsky, and this is a Eurasia Group Foundation production. Today, my guest is Jessica Trisko Darden, an assistant professor of political science at Virginia Commonwealth University. Good afternoon, Jessica. Thank you for joining me.
Good to be here.
So you're obviously a non-resident fellow with Eurasia Group Foundation. I was wondering if you could take a second and just tell me about yourself and your research.
So I work mainly on political violence and its various manifestations, and more specifically on kind of two different facets of political violence. I'm really interested in understanding the international causes of violence abroad. So the role that the United States plays in supporting regimes that perpetrate human rights abuses, for instance. But I'm also interested in exploring the gender dynamics of violence that occurs, and in particular, how our assumptions about gender map onto our mechanisms for holding perpetrators accountable.
Okay, so there are some fascinating ideas, and I readily admit I've read a lot of your work, and I'm a fan. So I think there's something I want to start with, which is assumptions about gender. So obviously, you're an expert in political violence. Let's begin our conversation with what are the assumptions around gender and political violence.
Yeah, I think what we've seen come out of institutions like the United Nations and its gender, peace, and security work is this idea that women are natural peacemakers, that women are better at solving conflict just by dint of their gender, the very fact that they are women, that somehow women are cognitively wired differently, have different hormones and different ways of thinking about the world. And we see this echoed in a lot of talk of leaders as well, that somehow women leaders made it through the COVID pandemic better than their male counterparts, had better outcomes for their countries, etc. Except there's no actual factual basis for any of these presumptions. There's no evidence that women are by nature better leaders. Just as there's no evidence that by nature women are less violent. I think that we don't take into consideration a lot of the political opportunity structures that drive individuals' participation in political violence or wartime violence. And we also don't really consider the way that societal norms either constrain or enable acts of violence as well.
So I know that your book Insurgent Women talks about Ukraine, which is pertinent because obviously there's an ongoing war in Ukraine. And so I was wondering if you could talk about the role of women in Ukraine historically, or how the role of women in conflict in Ukraine has evolved over time.
Yeah, and I think this is a really pressing question because a lot of the contemporary media coverage of this conflict looks at women in two ways, right? Women are heroes who are standing up to defend Ukraine, and this is exceptional because they're women. And then the other narrative is that women are being victimized in particularly unique ways, that they're victims of sexual violence, they're being raped by Russian soldiers. But of course, men also experience sexual violence. It's not exclusively women. And so I think we can kind of unpack both of these gendered frames. And the first, I would really point to the fact that women have historically been active in all of the conflicts that have shaped the future of the current independent Ukraine. So while what is now Ukraine was under Polish sovereignty, women participated in Ukrainian nationalist movements and uprisings. They participated in contestations over control of Ukrainian territory during the Second World War. They resisted first Nazi and then Soviet occupation. But Ukrainian women also participated, as did men, right, in the Red Army. And so we see that Ukrainian women in the contemporary conflict have participated both in defense of the Ukrainian state and in the Ukrainian armed forces, right? The kind of nationalist sense. But we've also seen women participate on behalf of Russian-backed rebel groups in Donetsk and Luhansk. And so, again, we shouldn't expect women to behave in a particular way in this given conflict. Rather, we're seeing women participate in ways that are quite similar to their male counterparts, supporting both Russian backed forces from 2014 onwards, and more significantly today, supporting the Ukrainian armed forces and to territorial defense units.
So this sparks two questions for me. The first is there's this idea, and it's been used kind of racially and in gendered ways, about unit cohesion. And I'm wondering if you could speak to this idea. Is there historically, it seems to me that there is a concern about unit cohesion and gender dynamics. You are pointing to the fact that this is not the case. This is, or at least this is, we don't understand this correctly. And I know that the idea of unit cohesion and race totally falls apart. So could you speak to that in terms of gender?
So historically, arguments about unit cohesion have been a way for keeping marginalized groups out of service. And if we look at this in the American context, unit cohesion was a key argument for the maintenance of segregated units within the US military. To prevent African Americans from fighting alongside their white counterparts. The military elite, which was, of course, predominantly almost exclusively white during this period, argued that this would undermine unit cohesion. We saw the same arguments being made during the Don't Ask, Don't Tell period, that the outing of gay service members would undermine unit cohesion, that heterosexual service members would not want to serve alongside gay service members, even though they were, of course, doing so in practice. And unit cohesion was, again, a key justification of the combat exclusion, which prevented American servicewomen from serving in direct combat roles. Of course, all of those regulations have since been repealed. Because again, there was no factual basis. Rather, these were driven by innate human biases. And so what we're seeing on the ground in Ukraine is that even though Ukraine has, like the United States, repealed all combat exclusions, as of 2018, every position in the Ukrainian armed forces was equally open to men and women. We do continue to see that women are being kept away from frontline combat roles, and that women are also being kind of uniquely positioned in what we would call gendered roles within the military. So women are predominantly serving as medics, for example. This is often because women are more likely to have nursing experience, but it's also a role that kind of has an ambiguous legal status in terms of combatant status and international humanitarian law. We're also seeing women serving in the territorial defense units, which are not frontline units in the same way that some aspects of the Ukrainian armed forces are. And so it's very easy to see that gender is continuing to influence how women are being placed operationally in the current conflict, even though there's no legal restrictions on women's participation.
Okay, and so I do want to talk about this idea a little bit more of legal status as fighters. If you could kind of unpack the why it's important that women serve in medical roles and have this ambiguous legal status. Why is that something that should be interesting to us?
So I actually find this the most interesting part personally of what's going on in Ukraine right now. In that we've seen in the press many reports of women, volunteering to serve in the armed forces, standing up, defending their homeland. And women are doing this in a wide variety of ways. So some, of course, are joining the official Ukrainian armed forces, territorial defense units, and other units operated by the Ministry of the Interior. But women are also doing kind of informal methods of participation in the conflict. So at the very beginning in last February, women were, for instance, preparing caseloads of Molotov cocktails, right, as self-defense. There were wonderful reports of 60, 70, 80-year-old women training for combat service bearing arms. And this is really important because each of these different functions is governed, regulated by international humanitarian law differently, right? So if a woman is bearing arms and identifying herself as a combatant, saying, I'm here to fight the invading Russian forces, then under international law, that individual should be considered a combatant, not a civilian, right? And a different legal regime protects their rights, but they also become a legitimate target for violence. Similarly, women who are creating Molotov cocktails are an incendiary device. They're considered a weapon under international law. And we know that even though munitions workers tend to be civilians, they're treated as combatants under international law because an arms factory is a legitimate target for military force. And so even though we talk mainly about women serving in the Ukrainian armed forces, I would argue that we're really not broadening our conceptualization of the ways in which women contribute to armed conflict sufficiently. If we turn specifically to those women in the armed forces, as I mentioned, they're kind of being put in these more feminized or marginalized roles. And that's really important because it has several knock-on effects. What we saw from 2014 until 2018 was that even though women were serving in what were essentially frontline combat positions in Eastern Ukraine, they weren't receiving veteran designations. They weren't receiving combat veteran benefits in the way that their male counterparts were. And that created a lot of tension. And we actually saw that same tension with US forces and female personnel who were deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan. That although they were very much on the front lines, they were not being designated as so by the military. And this discrimination was in both instances raised by the women themselves. Okay. It also affects how we see women's contributions to conflict and women's exposure to violence. And so we've actually had very few female Ukrainian military personnel killed thus far in the conflict, which tells me that they're not being put on the front lines in the same way that men and particularly male conscripts are. And that sense of protecting women really does link into kind of prevalent gender ideologies.
Okay, so we're talking a lot about Ukraine and kind of conventional warfare. Your book is called Insurgent Women. And so I'm keen to understand, are there differences between fighting or meaningful differences fighting a conventional war from a female perspective as compared to a non-conventional kind of insurgency warfare?
That's a fantastic question. I think what we see a lot in insurgent groups is that the hierarchy is a lot flatter. So although there is leadership, that leadership is obviously much closer to the so-called foot soldiers. And what we see in many, though not all, insurgent groups is that ideology really matters. And many insurgent groups, particularly those with a Marxist tinge, actually really actively adopt gender egalitarian platforms that advocate for women's recruitment, participation, and in some instances, which create or preserve a leadership role for women within the organization. Oftentimes in the political arm, but also within the military arm as well. Women are also much more able to, I think, live freely, live similarly to their male counterparts within insurgent groups. Governance of sexual relations is very different within insurgent groups than, for instance, traditional national militaries. Women and men are able to form romantic partnerships with each other, with members of the same sex in some instances. Women are also, in some instances, able to bear children without leaving the military group, although this is relatively rare. In many instances, women undergo forced abortions or abandon the child to the care of others. And so I think that membership in an insurgent group really impacts women's lives in different ways. But it is also true that some insurgent groups, if we think of, for instance, Boko Haram in Nigeria, hew really, really strongly to very patriarchal norms that have clearly delineated responsibilities for women that are not what we would consider in the West egalitarian. And so I think there's a lot more variation amongst insurgent groups than there are within national militaries, which, at least in the case of NATO member countries and aspiring NATO member countries like Ukraine, have very clear gender policies which say women should be allowed to serve on an equal basis with men, that we have clear target goals. We'd like at least a quarter of the military to be female if possible, that have, policies in place regarding sexual discrimination, even though those policies are rarely followed. And so we do see kind of emerging norms for how women should be treated within national military organizations, and we see kind of much more disparate outcomes amongst insurgent groups.
So maybe this is the wrong question to ask, but who are the top performers in the conventional space and in the insurgent space when it comes to egalitarian fighters? So I would imagine would probably be someone like the Tamil Tigers would have like a large female proportion of its fighters. Or in your experience, in your research, what are the groups that stand out to you, and what are the countries that stand out to you as doing well in terms of being equal?
Yeah, and I think well is really subjective too, right? And so we can point to groups like the Tamil Tigers, like the Maoist insurgents in Nepal, like the FARC in Colombia, or the ELN in El Salvador, that had relatively high levels of female participation, right? So between 15 and 30%. It's very difficult to pin down actual numbers, in part because these conflicts lasted in some instances for multiple decades. Women moved in and out of the group. Membership numbers changed dramatically over time. So we kind of have loose senses of how many women may have participated in these groups, most notably as a kind of proportion of overall strength, right? And in many of these groups, women had emancipatory experiences. They left their patriarchal home lives behind. They were empowered. They did things that women in their societies didn't do, right? Bear arms, fight, be politically educated, engage in political discourse. But in many of these conflicts, once war ended, a lot of those emancipatory experiences were left behind. So for instance, in the case of Nepal, marriages within the Maoist forces took place across caste lines. And when war ended, those intercaste marriages weren't accepted broadly in Nepali society. And so those couples either dissolved, broke up, or moved to communities where neither individual was from, where their caste identities could be hidden. Right now in Colombia, we're seeing kind of a lot of challenges regarding the implementation of the Havana peace process, a lot of blowback against the FARC, and many women who had, again, these emancipatory experiences within the FARC now find themselves discriminated against in Colombia and are having difficulty reintegrating into society. On the national military side, the countries that have really been a leader in having greater gender equality have done so through a lot of legal challenges. Germany led with integration of women into their forces, in part because women sued the German military to be allowed to participate, as was the case with many service academies in the United States as well. And so we really haven't seen many countries be able to kind of break this 20% threshold of forces. And even within a country like Israel, which has mandatory conscription of both men and women, we find that women are discriminated against during their service, but also after their service. Women are
their service is shorter in Israel.
Absolutely. And so there's just a lot of questioning of what, in the question of who's doing this well, what does well mean, right? Does well mean the opportunity to serve, the opportunity to join elite units, or does it mean how you are being treated in the roles and spaces that you're inhabiting? And I think that latter question is what really needs to be worked on moving forward.
So obviously, and we also all need to be communists because they do better in recruiting women.
But, I think it's really difficult because some groups that had these very gender egalitarian platforms also had, really poor treatment of LGBTQ plus members, or had really draconian approaches to pregnancies and pregnancy terminations and abortions. And so in many ways, this kind of embrace of women was also a kind of stifling death grip. And so I would be hard pressed to say that I think ideology matters. I don't think the ideology of a group necessarily led to a qualitatively different experience for women across different ideologies. It just affected the proportion of women within those groups.
So this leads me to another question about, so in state militaries, there are clear, you talked about Israel, there are clear recruitment or conscription guidelines, right? Either everyone serves or some people serve, and this is how long, this is how you get in, here's the office you go to. But in insurgencies, this is not the case. These formal structures don't exist. So there is a really important question, or a compelling question in my mind, regarding how women are recruited. I have personally worked in Northeast Nigeria on issues related to Boko Haram, and there's a lot of forced recruitment, or women are brought in with men who are recruited or join the organization, and there's a lot of trauma that happens associated with joining a group that way. My question for you is then, how are women in non-traditional militaries recruited? And we're going to, this is relevant to Ukraine, obviously, because there are various non-state actors fighting in this conflict. But in general, so we have a sense of, how non-conventional militaries are getting women in, even the good ones, quote unquote, if you will.
I would just start off with the fact that conscription is coercive recruitment, right? We have processes of conscription because individuals are not voluntarily joining military units. Okay. And so the idea of kind of forcible conscription being fundamentally different from a more legalistic process of conscription, I would just kind of red flag that. But yes, absolutely. If we're talking about abductions, conscription that occurs with direct coercion, that is qualitatively different. What we see in terms of women's recruitment is that it can very much look like the patterns that we observe in terms of Boko Haram's processes of abducting young women. This is being done currently with Islamic State affiliates in Mozambique. This has been done, of course, by the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda and other armed groups as well. We've seen a little bit of that in Latin American insurgencies as well. But there are some other pull factors that I do think affect women differently, and not just women, girls as well, that affect females differently than males. And one, I think that gendered insecurity in the household can affect females very differently. So we've seen in some instances young women joining groups like ISIS, but also Kurdish groups fighting against ISIS in an attempt to flee forced or arranged marriages. I think that's something that is kind of really unique to the female experience that I would draw people's attention to. We also see, of course, sexual violence being used very differently in terms of recruitment. So the sense that if a female is kind of violated by a group or a group member under some social systems, they then become almost irrevocably linked to or tied to that group. And that can actually be actively used as a kind of forcible recruitment mechanism. But in general, we also see women voluntarily joining groups, either because of ideological alignment, right? They believe in the group, they believe in its cause and its goals. We also see women joining out of a sense of patriotism, right? Defense of homeland, and that doesn't always lead them to join a state group. It can also lead them to join an insurgent group. And lastly, we see women joining because of their relationships to other individuals, to males. So as you noted, so a big pull factor for women who joined Islamic State, for instance, was being brought along by a male family member. In some instances, that was a parent or a brother or a husband. And so I think women are subject to those familial pressures and those kind of social exclusion dynamics in ways that are different from males.
And then, of course, we haven't really had a chance to talk about the PKK in Turkey, where it all falls apart, where apparently everyone is joining because there's life there is just awesome. I think I probably have the wrong read of this, but the reporting on the PKK is fascinating. And I don't know if do you see a difference in the PKK, or does this kind of fit with the larger rubric?
Well, I think my colleague Ora Suckley has done a lot of work on the PKK, and what one of the findings she draws attention to is that there is variation within Kurdish groups. So we have the PKK based in Turkey. We obviously have aligned groups operating in Syria, but there's also PJAK, which operates in Iran and Iraq. And so we see that kind of where Kurdish groups are organized along different familial or clan lines, we see different kind of behaviors arising. And so I think that there are some contextual factors with amongst Kurdish groups that get missed because the PKK is the most prominent and most dominant, and has explicitly adopted in its founding that there would be a male head and a co-equal female head. And so that is very, very unique in terms of armed group structure. But we see other Kurdish insurgent groups being less egalitarian. So I don't think it's something fundamental about being an ethnic Kurd that makes you more egalitarian. I think it's about the broader social structures in which these groups are embedded.
This is really cool, I think, because one of the things I hear, the undercurrent here, is that recruitment, whether you're a man or a woman, revolves around social networks and the types of social networks you're ensconced in, if you will. And that's fascinating to me because I think social networks are, I mean, I think they're studied in the sociology, but in political science, I think we do kind of not the best job of understanding social networks. Correct me if I'm wrong, if I got my shoulders over my skis a little bit too much here, but are social networks an important part of this? Are they things that researchers are focusing on when looking at women being recruited into or joining or being recruited or coerced into these organizations?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we also have to keep in mind how social networks interact with gender ideologies and political opportunity structures, right? So your network, who you're friends with, who you're family members with, right? Who you go to a religious organization with, all of those things are shaped by gendered relationships as well, right? So maybe you only go to school with other women, right? And not males as well. That affects your social network, right? If you're not interacting with males outside your family on a regular basis, that constrains your social network in certain ways and perhaps directs you to engage more on the internet with individuals of another gender than you do in your regular life. But they're also interacting with kind of opportunity structures that allow people to leverage those social networks for kind of material or other benefits, right? So some individuals can leverage their social networks and get into prestigious universities and get great internships, right? And others find them subject to recruitment into gangs or armed groups because of the social networks that they're part of. And so social networks in and of themselves don't tell us much without that broader kind of social context, political context that help us understand how they're situated and how the individuals within those networks do or do not have agency. So for instance, if you're attending school, right, we consider that a great opportunity. But if you're attending school in a very, very insecure environment, it makes you at higher risk of recruitment into violence. And so what we would see, I think, as a kind of unmitigated good, being able to go to school can actually have some insecurity built into it. And I think that this kind of more nuanced understanding of how our exposure to society and our exposure to social networks affects our propensity to become engaged in violence of some kind is really where a lot of analysis is currently focused.
That's fascinating. So I think we've covered so much ground in this fascinating space, and I think it's a growing space with a lot of excellent people like yourself doing wonderful research. I want to thank you for taking the time to talk about Ukraine and gender and conflict in general. I obviously think this is fascinating, and your insights have been really illuminating and enlightening for me. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for the opportunity.